Hello and welcome to this Royal Society video podcast. I'm Wendy Barnaby, and today I'll be talking to Professor Andrew Biewener from Harvard University and Professor Tom Daniel of the University of Washington at Seattle. They've guest edited a special feature in the June issue of Biology Letters, and it's all about how animals move. We're talking about baby turtles, fish, birds, and insects. Now, Andy and Tom, I would have thought that we knew how animals moved. After all, Newton did leave us some quite serviceable laws of motion. But when I look through this issue, I see articles by mathematicians, engineers, neurobiologists, psychologists. I think you're trying to tell us something, that things aren't quite as simple as we think.
I'll take a stab at this one. Newton's laws are the best place to begin. But they stop well short of the dynamics that animals face. Newton was unfortunately unable to account for some of the more complex interactions between organisms and fluids, and it's only recently that we see that there's new media like wet sand, mud, and even the dynamics of air and water really went well beyond Newtonian principles. So he gave us the best start, but other great physicists have helped us more.
Well, I would say that he did, in fact, give us a great start, because we like to start simple, but it is a complicated world, and the world involves very complicated interactions of animals with the fluids that they live in or they move on. And one of the emerging aspects of the work that people are doing is they are looking at the temporal dynamics, how things change with time in terms of the forces that they have to produce to interact with their environment and the kinds of motions that result from those forces. And so it's really the complicated interaction of the animal with its environment that sets the stage for understanding the dynamics of what are the rules that govern how animals sense their environment and how they respond to interact with their environment.
Well, that brings us on to all the various issues you raise amongst these articles. Let's talk about them under three general headings. First of all, how an animal senses its environment. What are the main questions here, do you think?
Well, these are big open topics today, is how do animals acquire information and process it? We know that they acquire information with profound and exquisite accuracy, amazing precision, and amazing fidelity. But there are some big unknowns. Animals use vision, they use mechanical sensing, they use chemical sensing, and the big unknown today, and the challenge we have, is how do they weigh multiple modes of information?
Tom, can you give us an example of that?
Yeah, a great example is in one of the papers, authors provided an animal with a visual horizon that's moving and abruptly shift that visual horizon. It's done with a brilliant little electronic virtual world. On that abrupt shift, the animal turns itself, but also gets mechanical information from tiny structures. This is an insect called halteres. These are little reduced hind wings that act like gyroscopes. So they're picking up both visual information and rotational mechanical information to regulate their motion.
So this is about keeping stable.
Absolutely, about stability and about the ability to maneuver in really complex and delicate ways.
And I think that sensing of vision information, as well as sensing mechanical accelerations of the body, the rotations that occur, is fundamental to the studies that looked at the flight control of animals when they're making turns, and understanding how the rotations of the body interact with the forces that the wings have to produce when the animal turns. Similar kinds of interactions occur when animals are running on the ground. There was a paper that looked at how animals stabilize following perturbations to a sudden change in the motion of their body that has to be sensed by accelerating sensing organs in your inner ear that sense those kinds of rotations in the vestibular system. Now, these authors didn't explicitly look at how those direct sensations of those motions interact, but they had a theoretical paper that outlined some of the important aspects of how the mechanics of their body's movement can help simplify the problem of sensing and control of body motion.
Well, that brings us on to the second of these general headings, which is how an animal processes the information that it takes in from the environment. What do you think the general issues are here?
The work that's being done now in sensory-motor integration deals with primary sensory systems like the visual system, or mechanotransduction, or olfactory cues for sensing chemical signals. But I think the processing of information is, the level that people are analyzing it has to be done in a very more peripheral or simple way of trying to understand how information that you control with the animal's senses is then responded to in a particular motor action of the animal.
So you're saying we don't really understand as much about this as we do about the other areas?
This is beyond the work of making decisions about where an animal will move or how it will respond in a particular case is pushing the limits of where people can study at this point. One of the papers looked at escape responses of fishes. That's a classical paradigm of the startle response of a fish to a mechanical signal that's a noxious signal to the animal. The fish is touched or it sees something in its environment and it moves quickly away. But that's a response of the animal that's pretty much built into its sensory system in the way it responds in terms of its motor escape response.
I think that amplifying on that, the real challenge is to say, how do you take all of that sensory information that we just talked about, multiple modes of sensory information, process it, and repackage this as a set of neural signals that drive a set of muscle movements, which in turn drive an appendage that produces forces. Right away, we're at that stage of understanding how the central nervous system and peripheral aspects of it condition information and repackage it in ways that drive specific motions of bodies and appendages. Following up on that fish paper, we saw that the brain actually is highly lateralized, that there's a right side and a left side, and that lateralization of both sensory information processing also affects lateralization of the motor output.
So the brain's dealing with these inputs in two specific parts. Is that what you're saying?
In the case of the fish, now probably in most central nervous systems, all the way from the insect clearly up to vertebrates.
Well, coming on to our third general topic, once the animal has processed the information that it got from the environment, then the brain sends signals to its legs or wings or whatever, and these signals then create forces on those appendages, which actually produces movement. What do we know about this?
Well, I think this is one of the areas that we know and gaining much insight more than some of the other areas. We know for some time people have studied animals moving on the ground and measuring. That's a system where you can measure the forces the animal exerts on the ground or the ground exerts back on the animal, and you have a clear understanding of how those forces are being produced by the muscles and how the animal responds to it. I think where the field is moving is more towards looking at animals having to interact with more complex environments, running outside, natural terrain. And so one of the papers that looked at the hatchling turtles moving across the substrates asked the question of what does an animal do when it's moving through loose sand versus very hard surface texture like a hardened sand. And it's the solution to how the animal moves, this little hatchling loggerhead turtle, as it's trying to escape into the sea, its first day of life, it actually uses its flipper in a way that it can compact the soil, the sands, in a way that can push itself against the ground. Where it becomes more complicated is for animals moving through the air or moving through fluids like water and air. And measuring the forces under those fluid regimes is much more complicated. Tom knows something about that because he works in this area.
So fluid dynamics is that part of the physics that escaped Newton. And that's the part that actually gave rise to a whole branch of mathematics. Partial differential equations was actually initially developed to deal with complex fluid motions. It's important to realize that that's still a challenge, that how an organism's fin or wing interacts with a dynamic fluid medium is extremely complex. And the traditional aerodynamic or fluid dynamic models we've used tend not to work very well. That is, organisms flap their appendages, spin them in ways which sort of confound traditional engineering analyses. So the authors that looked at the fin moving and visualizing the wake that forms, they're using a visualization of the flow to infer the kinds of forces that might happen. Other authors were looking at how flapping of wings and the asymmetry induced during a turn yields fluid dynamic forces that may give stabilization and correction of turns. And some authors are even using highly advanced computational methods to illuminate the sorts of flows that occur even around a very primitive organism like a jellyfish. There they're bringing to bear some of the most advanced mathematical and engineering approaches to understand the dynamics of force production and fluid motion.
Well, given that movement is so important to animals, it's a very important thing for them to be able to do to survive. So are we talking about really efficient movement here?
Well, absolutely. I think the economy of movement is one of the hallmarks of one of the things we learn is how animals move very efficiently and effectively. It's not always the case that energy is the only currency in movement. Sometimes animals will expend great energy to move quickly, but over periods of long-term activity, especially animals that are more regularly active, the ability to produce motions of the body that is economical in energy expenditure and provide smooth movement trajectories, I think, is one of the hallmarks of all forms of locomotion, whether an animal runs on the ground with legs, or whether it's flying through the air with wings, or it's swimming through the body with fins and flippers. So it's really, I think the ability to move economically and smoothly is one of the hallmarks that natural selection has solved the problem of moving on the way in which controlling animal motion to be able to generate those kinds of movement patterns.
I was going to add, though, that economy is a major criterion that we focus on for movement. But, as one of the papers point out, that you can remove great amounts of a wing from an insect, and it still seems to be able to fly, although it takes an incredible experimental manipulation to detect the effect of massive wing removal on flight performance, that is, an ability to capture a prey or escape predation.
Yeah, that was actually really a surprising and remarkable result, that you can actually have such levels of wing damage in insects and not really see clearly observable deficiencies in flight performance until you really use the advantage of high-speed video to track motion at very short time scales to be able to see what, and then also be able to test and quantify that there is a diminished capacity on flight performance and prey capture, which becomes ecologically and evolutionary critical to the success of the animal. So selection for a wing design is critically important, but it's not always obvious that how much of that design is necessary for a successful performance.
And if I might riff on that once, that actually is the point of this volume, and that is that the nervous system and muscular system can actually make adjustments and adapt plastically and immediately to perturbations that are going on. And maybe this is the big open area, is how the nervous system, the muscular system, and all of the aerodynamics work together, or fluid dynamics or solid mechanics, to allow an organism to keep performing, to keep avoiding prey or predators and attacking prey. And that's the big issue, is how does it plastically adapt very quickly to these things?
Taking this research forward then, what issues are coming up in the future? What do you think this will enable us to do that we haven't been able to do so far without knowing all this?
Well, I think there are really two big domains that this general research area focuses on. First is that we're learning from biological systems how motion is controlled and how high fidelity, highly maneuverable creatures can manage these tasks with really simple nervous systems. That's inspiring potential new technologies for small robotic devices, for search and exploration.
Yeah, I think a big area is a prosthetic design, that there's not a robotic device or a robot that moves with the fluidity that animals are able to move, whether it's an insect or a terrestrial vertebrate or a flying animal. And the capacity for developing prostheses that can repair lost function is something that's critically important. And I think that we're seeing great advances in neuroprostheses and mechanical prostheses that help return functionality to the individual. And in the health setting, this is really a big area, and it's a big area that's drawing a lot of work from computational computer scientists with engineers and biologists working together. And so I think this kind of interaction between computer scientists, mathematicians, and engineers with biologists that we see in these theme papers are very much the kinds of interactions that the engineering sciences and biology are going to be able to bring to bear on solving those kinds of problems in the future. We're seeing the move towards studying animals and the ability to track animal motion in natural environmental settings. And I think this is going to be critically important because those are the environments that the animals inhabit, and those are the environments that we also, as people moving through the natural world, have to inhabit. So it's an important area to be able to move the study of animal movement and its control and dynamics to the outside world.
Yes, one of your researchers, after all, was sitting in a dinghy tracking moths as they flew over the Panama Canal. So you can't really get much more out of the laboratory than that. Well, thank you very much indeed, Tom and Andy.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. That's all from this video podcast. Goodbye.